Nate Silver, I mean, he really needs no introduction, but he writes the Silver Bulletin and is the author of On the Edge, The Art of Risking Everything, now on paperback with a new foreword. And before we get going, I just want to say thanks, Nate. Writing on the internet is scary, and you've made it less scary. I think this sort of like getting to the point where I can just say things that I know are going to piss off, administration officials and $5 trillion companies like takes a lot. And sort of watching you do that over the years has been a good sort of lodestar for just like not caring what powerful and rich people think and just trying to work towards the truth.
I appreciate it, Jordan. And I haven't met you before. We just learned that we're like about a 7-minute walk away from one another in New York. But I think the equilibrium is just like people in media are way too short-term focused and like way too susceptible to peer pressure, right? And kind of conversely, once you develop a reputation for like, I'm going to do my reporting, do my reading, do my thinking, speak from a place of knowledge and experience, right? But just not try to sanitize things too much. I mean, I think you develop trust with your audience and you carve out more of a distinct niche or brand, if you want to use that overused term. And like, yeah, I just think people are like, I don't know, too afraid of honesty and differentiation. I mean, it's easy to say if you cover fields like electoral politics that are in sports that are like popular and get a lot of audience and traffic. That much is true. I'm not doing like investigative reporting here, but like, but I do think that like, working hard and being the best version of yourself and being an honest version of yourself is usually a smart strategy in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, it's something I think even more difficult with policy writing. Like, I'm closer to a think tank than I am a journalist. And like the vast majority of people who work in this field, their public comments are either off the table because they either work in the government or work in government relations for a big company. Or even if you are at a think tank, like you have to pay the bills somehow. And that basically means getting corporate sponsorship of your work, which kind of, in some insidious ways, for better or for worse, ends up sort of tracking how you can talk about different stuff. So,
yeah, no, look, I mean, I find as a consumer, then there are lots of issues, including China, which, I've been to Hong Kong 3 times, never really been to mainland China, the Beijing airport once, right? But like, China is among like many issues where like, gosh, I'm not quite sure who to believe or who to trust, right? And I feel like I'd have to like invest a lot of time in investigating who I can trust. That requires like, at that point, you could almost write about it yourself. And there are a lot of issues like that, right? Where it's like, gosh, I'm not sure there's any kind of trustworthy authority. I mean, kowtowing to corporate power is part of it. I mean, that's part of the beauty of having a Substack model where no advertising, right? But also like, yeah, especially in kind of diplomatic international relations, people are always calibrating what they say, right? So I'll be a lot of the time, I guess I won't give an example and pick a fight, but like the people who I think are smart commentators, but you're always saying, okay, if they're saying this, then what they really think must be that, right? And sway degrees to the left, 20 degrees to the right. And then it's just a lot more work than longer formats where you're able to communicate with more nuance and honesty and subtlety.
I mean, there's this recent, I guess, micro scandal. Robert O'Brien, former national security advisor, wrote an op-ed saying we should sell lots of NVIDIA chips to China. It comes out 3 days later that like NVIDIA is a client of his. And, that's the sort of thing where you can get away with it if you're saying, if it's in an 800 word, but like you can skate over it from in an 800 word context. But like once you get to the 3,000 word version of it, it's less, oh, here's a former national security advisor saying X. It's more like, are the arguments convincing, right? And I don't know, it's tough.
Yeah, I'm never quite sure whether to say, okay, take everything tabula rasa and ignore who's making the argument, just assess the argument. And the fact that like, people have long-term credibility and reputational issues. One of the things I do is play poker, right? And in poker, the same action from a different player. It can mean vastly different things, and a lot of stuff is subtextual. A lot of stuff is like deliberately ambiguous. One reason why I think large language models like ChatGPT and Claude are interesting is because they understand that like you can kind of mathematicize language, and like in some ways language is a game in the sense of game theory, and that it's strategic, right? And what we say and exactly how we say it and what's left unsaid is often powerful. And a single word choice can matter a lot, right? I mean, you probably think of it in a different context in the case of, I suppose, official statements by the Chinese government or whatever else. But yeah.
Yeah, no, let's stay on this though, because this was actually like one of my mega brain takes I kind of want your response to is like, we have Nate Silver, 11 years old, wanting to be president. And now we've had 20 years of him thinking about analyzing presidents and presidential candidates and what they do. And you don't, I think, necessarily have to believe in AGI and fast takeoff to think that, say, 10, 20, 30 years down the road, a lot of the decisions that presidents and executives take today, like an AI will just strictly dominate what the human would do. And that maybe that Cerberus moment of like what the Swedish prime minister was saying a few days ago, like, oh yeah, I ask ChatGPT all the time for like advice, just becomes, no, like you should just listen to the AI. So I don't know where you, like, feel free to take that wherever you want, but I'm curious sort of maybe to start with, or feel free to take that wherever you want, comma, if you want a place to start, like what parts of the things that presidents and presidential candidates do you think are going to be automated the fastest, presuming that we just let them ingest all of the data that your president or executive would be able to consume themselves?
I mean, look, AI in its current form might be an improvement of a lot of our government elected officials, but that says a lot more about the officials than the AI necessarily. Yeah, look, I don't take for granted, and some people do, right, including people who know a lot about the subject, I don't take for granted that we're going to achieve superhuman general intelligence, and there are different valences between these terms that we can parse if you want, right? But, some of the reason that AIs are, large language models, I should say, are good now is because they do, A, they train on human data, and B, they get reinforcement learning with human feedback, right? And there are cases like pure math problems where you can extrapolate out from the training set in a logical way. For more subjective things like political statements, I don't know as much, right? Some people believe that AIs could become like super persuasive. And I'm skeptical. First of all, I think humans will be skeptical of AI generated output, although maybe I'm more skeptical than the average person might be. Also, it's a dynamic equilibrium, right? You can message test, have an AI, let's say you train an AI, and it can figure out, okay, we can now predict, we're running all these ads, sending out all these fundraising emails, we can kind of predict which will get a higher response rate. Well, when people start seeing the same email, Nancy Pelosi says this or that 50 or 100 times, then they adjust and react and kind of backlash to it. In general, in domains like poker, where you're approaching some equilibrium, then profit's not easy to have, right? There's not easy tricks. You have to like play a robust kind of smart strategy, and ultimately the strength of your can matters, right? And how precisely you're kind of constructing the mix of strategies that you take in any given time, right? So look, I think there's like I don't know if I bucket it, like a 25% chance. I mean, let's put it in thirds, right? Or no, let's put it, 25% chance that like on relatively short timelines, AI just blowing our socks off, right? 25% that like it does that, but at a longer timeline, decade, 2 decades, 3 decades out, right? And then 50% were like AI is a very important technology, as are more important than the internet or the automobile, and reshapes things, but does not fundamentally reshape human dynamics across a broad range of fields. And things like international relations or politics are, I think, one of the more resistant domains, I would think, toward toward AI solutions, quote unquote. At the same time, I do think another risk is that you'll have people who like view the AIs as oracular, right? We've seen cases of people who are encouraged by ChatGPT to think they've developed some new scientific theorem or discovered a new law of physics, right? They're very smart at like flattering you, right? And like, one of the things I do is I build models, and sometimes a bad model is worse than no model, right? Or your kind of implicit like mental model. And so like trusting an all-knowing and all-powerful algorithm, especially in a case where the situation is dynamic, right? The laws of mathematics don't change, but like international relations and politics are always dynamic and maybe changing faster. And whether the AIs can like adapt to new situations quickly is also an open question.
Yeah, I mean, like, if we're trying to bucket, like, the types of things a CEO or a president or a senator does, I mean, we have some sort of, like, personnel management, right, of, like, who am I going to hire, who am I going to fire? We have the outward-facing stuff of, like, okay, what do I say to this interviewer? How do I talk in the debate? And then we have these, like, decision points, right, where, like, you have a memo, you could pick A, B, or C, and there are, a different set of trade-offs where, you could optimize for this thing or for that thing. And, like betting on, we'll save that. But I don't think it's crazy to think that parts of those different buckets of things you need to do, you could have AI like radically improve if even just to like play out the different, like second and third order effects of whatever you're negotiating for in the next budget bill or something.
For discrete tasks, yeah, I mean, AI can already be wonderful, right? I'm doing a little coding now on a National Football League NFL model, right? And like, it's late at night, I've been up a long time, had some wine at dinner, and I'm like, okay, Claude, how do you do this thing in the language I'm programming in, right? Where the thing is a discrete thing, where it's like, okay, I have enough experience with these models where I expect it to give a good answer, and I have enough domain knowledge where like, I plug in this code, I can tell if it works or not, right? I'm not going to have some bad procedure that then chains into other bad procedures in a complicated model. And so like, yeah, there's been mixed evidence on like how much more productive AI makes people. My stylized impression is that like, it makes the best people even more productive, and it makes the people who are not that smart maybe worse. You know what I mean? And yeah, I worry that it'll be a substitute for domain knowledge and human experience. But for certain things, it's already superhuman, and for other things, it's dumb as shit. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And like knowing what is what, I think there is a learning curve for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's also this aspect of like the human floor can be pretty low, especially like if you're tired or stressed, or you're like the president and you've got 100,000 things that are being thrown in your face, and like it is literally an impossible job. So I think it's coming, man. I don't know. And maybe there's also this like weird electoral feedback thing where, again, presuming that AI is really helpful to, winning in governance, that like the folks who trust it more faster are the ones who perform better in their jobs and get elected to higher and higher office.
No, government is backward in a lot of ways, right? In some ways, I mean, this is very driven country by country too, right? In some ways, it's kind of like America has maintained a relatively high degree of international hegemony despite having this constitutional system that's now hundreds of years old, and I think, has flaws that people, to sound a little bit partisan here, right? I mean, I think Trump has found a way to like exploit some of those flaws, right? It's kind of amazing that like, that we still entrust all of this power in one president. You know what I mean? Like, I think probably New York City, 8 million people, is probably about as large an entity as you should have like maybe one person in charge of, right? But we haven't really developed other systems. And if anything, maybe, look, what are the more dynamic places in the world right now? I mean, you'd still say the U.S., you'd say China, and then probably the Middle East, right? And they,
They kind of cheated.
yeah, and the U.S. is increasingly less democratic, and the other two are not really democratic. You know what I mean? And so maybe my assumptions have been wrong.
So taking a step back, like in covering the way you've covered politics, has it sort of shaped your take or breakdown on like a great man versus structuralist view of how things unfold?
I mean, the kind of empirical default, I think, is to, the trendy thing is to be more structuralist. I don't know. I kind of think that like Donald Trump is a very important figure. And if Donald Trump had, I think Donald Trump is kind of funny, right? If he had been a stand-up comedian instead, I think the world would look a lot different. I think Elon Musk has been very important to the shape of the world. I'm not saying positively or negatively. I think she is very important. And like, no, look, and things are trending more that way, right? I mean, people, I'm not some like Elizabeth Warren type, but, if the top richest people in the world basically double their wealth every decade, right? And it's different people cycle in and out of the list. But like, if you look at like the inflation adjusted list of the richest, whatever, 10, 100 people, and it's often more about the 10 now than the 100, right? They basically double their wealth, inflation adjusted every 10 years. And you compound that over several cycles. And like, yeah, I mean, that concentration of power, I think might shift things more toward a great man theory. I'm sure there's like a substantial degree of like randomness too. I have no idea how China formed, for example, but like, you get in these feedback loops where you have a virtuous loop or a less virtuous loop. And like, 30 years ago, Americans were worried about like being overtaken by Japan. And I happened to Japan a few times. And like, in some ways it's a very, very amazing advanced society, right? And so maybe a better example is like Rome, Italy, which is like one of my favorite places to travel to. And I've been to at different points in my life. There are parts of Rome where if you go to them today in 2025, they don't really look that much different than when I was a college kid in 1999, 2000, right?
Sure.
Except for the cell phones, that you could really be placed into 2000 and you wouldn't really miss a beat.
So, slight non sequitur. My favorite dad book is called Italian Education. It's this memoir of a cranky British person who married an Italian woman, and talking about raising their kid in sort of early 1990s Italy. And it's like really fun kind of new journalism style writing, but it's also this fascinating just portrayal of this country at this big transition moment where they're going from like being super Catholic to more modern, and being very localized to like conceiving of themselves as like part of this European project. And I don't know, I don't have great 2025 Italy takes, but it's interesting just how much further or not further like a country could have gone from that moment to today, looking at different parts of the world from 1994 to the present.
Yeah, I have a friend who's Irish, like actually Irish, not Irish American, who moved here, I think in early adulthood, and gay. And he's like, yeah, when I was growing up, like Ireland was like very Catholic and very anti-gay, and now they almost go out of their way to be pro LGBTQ whatever rights, right? And it is interesting, you know what I mean? And conversely, how maybe Russia and that sphere are separating a bit more. I think the United States is diverging more from Europe too, where like, Europe hasn't grown a lot economically. There's not a lot of innovation there. At the same time, their lifespans are increasing, and they're kind of taking this like slower growing dividend into quality of life. Whereas in the US, I mean, like male life expectancies, even if you ignore COVID, have basically not increased in a decade, right? We are getting wealthier. And I don't know, I worry a little bit that like as we're doing things that undermine American leadership and state capacity, right? That we've been kind of playing the game on easy mode because the dollar is the world's reserve currency and the U.S. is the world's biggest military, and we've been this is complicated, relative to a low bar, a relatively trustworthy player in international relations, right? And if we're kind of throwing those things away, then it might not be there's an impact in next year, right?
Yeah.
But when you visit these different countries and you extrapolate out 3% GDP growth versus 1% and compound that over 20 years, right? It's extraordinarily powerful, and you see it on the ground where these places are stagnant and these places are growing.
Don't have a good transition. Talking about prediction markets, this kind of ties into like what the AIs can and can't do. But you've spent a lot of time sort of thinking about poker, and you had this whole experiment in your book where you just like spent a year betting on basketball. And the thing about basketball and the thing about poker is there's a lot of data, right? And there's a lot of track record, which you can sort of, base your estimation off. And okay, you can be, you have to find your edge in like very weird corners. But a lot of these markets on Polymarket and Kalshi are very one-off. Like right now, is Trump going to put more sanctions on Putin in the next 6 weeks? Like, is there a regression you can run on that? Like, not really. I don't know. It's fascinating because they're so much more kind of one-off and open-ended than like what you would see in the stock market or in sports betting.
Look, I think, and I'm a consultant for Polymarket, so here I do have a conflict of interest to disclose. Yeah, I think sometimes the one-off events are not as good, right? Like, so one market where I thought Polymarket, Kalshi, whatever else, did not do as well was the election of the new pope, where Prevost had like a very Pope Leo now, had a very low chance of being selected, right? So what happens there, on the one hand, you have a papal election every 10 or 20 years. So it's like not like you have a lot of data, right? You have everybody leaks, but the papal conclave does not leak apparently. So there's like not really any inside information. And then like people apply the heuristics they might apply to other things. Like when they have the smoke signals come out quickly, they're like, oh, it must be kind of like the most obvious name. So the favorites went up, right? And that wasn't true. People had no idea what was going on. So I think there are some limitations there versus things like elections, which are more regularizable. At the same time, there is a skill in estimation, right? And it's one that poker players and sports bettors have, right? Maybe I'm making a real-time bet on an NFL game and Patrick Mahomes gets injured, the quarterback of the Kansas City Chiefs, right? And I have to like estimate what effect this has on the probability of the Chiefs winning, right? And like, if you just do that a whole bunch, then you get better at it, right? And you have to have domain knowledge. You have to be smart in different ways. But like, and when I have consulted in the business world, right? Not like kind of capital C consulting, but people like who are actually making bets, then like you realize that like a good answer, a okay answer quickly is often what makes you money, whereas a perfect answer slowly doesn't. And I think that like, this is one reason we're learning that like, I think we've seen a shift of power away from academia toward for-profit corporations. You can say that's bad or good. I think we need both, frankly, right? But like, but you have a profit motive and you have an incentive to answer a question quickly. And in poker, the same thing, right? Like, if I play a hand and I'm like, well, I'm getting 2-1 from the pot, so I need to have the best hand or make my draw 1/3 of the time, right? And then you go back and run the numbers through a computer solver, they're called. And like, well, actually here I only had 31% equity when I needed 33%. So that was a big blunder, right? For most people, 31 versus 33 is the same. And then, but with training, you can estimate these things like with uncanny precision. I mean, there's a lot of implicit learning that goes on, right? And it kind of becomes second nature, I think.
Are you worried about insider trading with this, with all this political betting? I mean, there's an aspect of like, look, these are all crypto. You get on these markets with crypto, and like there were markets like which way is Suzanne Collins going to vote, and the sort of the like like the tail outcomes for like a legislative assistant in her office are you can make 10 times your salary in like a minute, right?
Yeah.
What's your thing on this?
For sure. I mean, look, I think there are a couple of qualifications though. Like, first of all, I think people on the inside often aren't as well as informed as they think, and or there's some downsides to having an inside view and not an outside view. You might drink the Kool-Aid, so to speak, right? You might be in a bubble. Yeah, look, I mean,
I mean, there are ones where it's like you can literally. I mean, there's been lots of group chats, people talking about like very, very sketchy trades and one-way bets that are being made in the stock market of like what's going to happen with a trade deal. I mean, you can literally be the person who decides, right, and be betting on the side on it. It's kind of weird.
If there are incentives to make money in a world of 8 billion people, many of whom are very competitive, and all of whom, not all of them, most of them have access to the internet, right? People are going to find a way to do it, right? It's not just that like whatever game theory equilibrium is a prediction of what occurs in the ideal world. It's what very much does happen, right? And we've seen things like in the crypto space, we've seen like an increasing number of like crypto kidnappings, right? Well, I mean, that's one of the consequences if people are worth vast amounts of wealth that isn't very secure. It's just gonna happen until you up security or have better solutions or whatever else. And so like, I don't think there's necessarily any more or less insider trading on like Polymarket than there might be for in sports betting sites. We've seen a lot of sports betting scandals, or for regular equities. I believe the literature says that like members of Congress achieve abnormal returns from their stock portfolios. I'd have to double. I'm sure there's some debate about that. I have to to double check that, right? People can also sometimes misread or read a false signal that becomes an insider or a fake signal, right? Like if they see an unusual betting pattern, they'll be like, oh, okay. Like there were some tennis betting scandals like this, where tennis is an easy sport to throw because it's individual. It's two people. So you don't need multiple conspirators, so to speak, right? And it's something unusual to be like, oh, there therefore must be an insider trading move, or that therefore must be someone throwing the match, right? And maybe sometimes it is, the other time it isn't. And it's very hard a priori to know which is which.
I mean, I guess it's a new variable like in politics, right? Where the way you could like cash out was like you become a spy for another country, very high risk, lots of downside, right? Or like, you have your career and then you become a lobbyist, but that's like something that pays out over years. And it's a new thing, and we're going to have to watch it because I get a lot of value out of seeing these numbers every day and watching how they change. Like Polymarket at this point is like sometimes I go there before looking at the homepages of major news outlets, but I don't know. There's something that makes me a little queasy about sort of opening up this new realm of betting where like maybe we, as citizens don't want the people who, we're paying to do these jobs to have this like alternate way to cash in.
Or for journalists too, right? I mean, I know a couple of projects where people are basically trying to apply a journalistic skill set to make trades, right? Not necessarily in prediction markets, maybe a little bit of that, but more just equities, right? If you have a well-informed view of China, maybe especially in particular industries, right? Then like that has big implications for how you might trade a variety of stocks, including like American stocks, right? My impression is generally that like, people at Wall Street firms trading equities, they don't like all this macro risk, right? They like to predict what the Fed is going to do, and they like earnings reports, and they like whatever long-term trends we can run regressions on them, right? They don't like profound political uncertainty where the macro bets are very long running, right? It may be hard to like come up with the right proxy for the trade that you want to make, right? And I think you'll probably see more of kind of a fusion between trading and research and journalism and kind of every step along that path potentially.
What do you think your legacy is now? And how would you want to change that in the next 10, 20 years of doing your thing?
I mean, look, I think the best work I've done is the book that I wrote a year ago on the Edge, now out in paperback. I think it's, look, I think the election models are valuable. I think they might be what I'm best known for, even though it feels like it's been like, 5 or 10% of my lifetime productive work and things like that. Yeah, look, it's a really hard question to answer. I don't think I'm quite old enough to answer that, right?
I can answer it. Maybe it was that.
Yeah, Jordan. What do you think?
Respond to mine then. I mean, look, I think there weren't a lot of numbers in a lot of discussions before you, and like with elections, like people have to put their money where their, I mean, not really put their money where their mouth is, but at least like respond to facts. And like the facts of you boiling all the polls and all the demographic data and voter registration data into like a thing is a much more tangible, like grounded set of facts than, oh, you say Marist, I say Quinnipiac. Like, what the fuck does that even mean? And it's that sort of spreading now into wider, on Polymarket and Kalshi, where like lots of different sort of modes of politics now have numbers attached to them in the ways they didn't. I mean, there's literally like a will China invade Taiwan market. Like you could not get a like, however much we want to believe anyone has any insight into that, there was no number you could point to sort of like ground you in that. So I mean, great man versus trends. Like there's been a lot of like, there's a lot more data, a lot more computing power that's happened over the past 25 years to like enable to do your thing. But I mean, I think it was both doing the modeling as well as presenting it in a voice which is like compelling and engaging that really helped it reshape the way people think about it.
I appreciate, I think I'm like, look, I know I have certain talents, right? But I think it's kind of like, if you're a 7 out of 10 on the modeling and a 7 out of 10 or maybe 8 out of 10, right, on the presentation, that overlap I think is somewhat rare, and the overlap is maybe more than the sum of the merely pretty good. I think I'm a good modeler. I think I'm pretty good at modeling, but the combination of those is valuable, I think. And I agree that like, the world is moving directionally more toward this. Prediction markets in particular, if you look at sports betting, it's not really growing as much as like the big industry players had hoped. But like, look, prediction markets have had some false starts before. I think now with Polymarket and Kalshi and Manifold and the others, right, you have a robust enough and a well-constructed enough trading ecosystem where like they are here to stay. And for a lot of things, then like if I am about to publish a story, let's say publishing a story on like Trump's latest round of tariffs, right? And I have to change the tariff if Trump has done anything crazy in the past 5 minutes since I last read the internet, right? I'll just go to Polymarket. Look, did any markets radically change here where maybe there's some mass event that would make it insensitive to publish a story? There's been some earthquake somewhere or something, you just kind of instantly kind of see that news. I mean, Twitter used to be somewhat like that for instant feedback. But it kind of also leads to this gamified ecosystem where like, as a poker player, sports bettor, or for that matter, as like someone who is a rapid news consumer, you're always checking your email, you're always checking your phone, you're always checking Twitter, you're always checking the internet. And you're kind of always aware of like 15 things at once, right? It makes it hard to unplug. It makes a distinction between like, what is my work life and my real life? Where are those boundaries? I mean, I don't know, right? If I'm running on the East Side and listening to a podcast, right? Like, and thinking about the next article I'm going to write, like that's work, right? If I'm checking my phone late at night when I'm out at dinner, right? That's kind of work if I'm checking work stuff and not gossip or whatever. And the world's moving more that way, I think, for for better or for worse. And I think it does prioritize quick computation and estimation.
I don't. The last point tying that to Nate Silver and the legacy, like it's harder to do big things anymore, or what is it?
No, I think it kind of creates like more of a barbell shaped distribution, right? We're like working on the book, which took me 3 years. Like that was a really important fundamental project, right? Right now I'm working on this National Football League model. Like I said, that's a 6-week project, not a 3-year project, but like that's kind of foundational work that will produce dozens of blog posts and hopefully hundreds or thousands of subscribers for many years for Silver Bulletin, right? I don't know, having 3 or 4 things that you're really interested in and you're fully invested in, I think is obsessions, you might call them. I think that's very valuable, right? But also the skill of like quick reaction, your best flash, 5-second estimate of your best flash in a newsroom setting, right? You know, having the first authoritative take on a Substack, right? When Zoran Mondani won the mayoral primary by a larger margin than predicted, I was in Las Vegas, the World Series of Poker. I just busted out of a tournament. And I'm like, I haven't really seen any great takes on this yet. And it's a very fruitful subject, right? And it was, midnight New York time, 9 Vegas time. I just cranked through until 3 a.m. Vegas time, 6 a.m. New York time, and published what I thought was a pretty smart story on it. And so that kind of thing is important. Whereas the middle ground, the ground occupied by like magazines, for example, right? Not that places like The Atlantic have become digital brands don't do great work, right? But like that's maybe the in-between where the turnaround is a little bit too slow to be the lead story in a very rapidly moving news cycle. But maybe it's not quite foundational work either. I mean, I think academia suffers from like even more of this problem, right? Where the turnaround time to publish a paper is just too slow. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Versus me, I'll run a couple of regressions and then give it a good headline and make some pretty charts, right? And it'll be 90% as good as like the academic paper in terms of the substantive work and like 150% better written because I'm writing for a popular audience and not journal editors, right? And, I think that's kind of that exchange of ideas is what moves the world. It's fascinating to see these dynamics. I mean, I don't know a lot about deepseek, for example, but it was interesting to see the kind of narrative shape in real time about kind of, just how China is competitive in the short to medium term on large language models. Like that was very interesting, right? Or to see with Zoran winning the primary, probably the general election too, we'll see, how much that's anchored the conversation in different ways and how like stylized, abstracted, modelized versions of the real world kind of become more dominant. And we're all model building, right? Even if you have a friend who's like a computational neuroscientist at University of Chicago, right? And he's like, ultimately the brain is a predictive mechanism, right? That when you are driving or something and looking to the road ahead, it's not quite like, and I'm butchering or paraphrasing him, it's not quite like you're seeing a literal real-time version of the landscape in front of you. It's like kind of a stylized version where your brain is making assumptions and filling in blanks because it's more efficient processing, right? That the message length can be shorter if you focus on the most important things. And you can notice this if you're in any type of altered state, whether it's a drug-induced state or you're under anesthesia or something like that, right? Or times of like,
or if you're just tired,
or times of extreme stress or stage fright, right? You process things differently. And kind of at a broader societal level, I think that's how it operates too, right? People are like, my first book, The Signal of the Noise, is kind of about why is the world so bad at like making predictions. And part of it is, well, you have to take shortcuts or else you'll never get anything done, right? But like when you are taking shortcuts, that leads to blind spots. And I don't think that's really solvable. I mean, AI might scrape off like some of the rough edges a little bit, but sometimes the rough edges are created by the market being efficient and dynamic, right? And by people like keying off other people's predictions, right? And forming a rapidly shifting consensus. And so those dynamics are going to remain very interesting, I think.
Yeah. I mean, it was sort of the DeepSeek experience was kind of surreal for me because, like, this is like a story, like China and AI is a story I've been following for 5-7 years, and all of a sudden it is like the story. And like, I think our team hit it pretty well. Like, we doubled our subscribers, great. But like, watching like our little thing try to like shape the broader narrative, and all of a sudden all these journalists are like, what's this company? I'm like, I've been writing about it for 2 years. Like, where have you guys been? Was just, it's, I've never had like one of my stories really become like the main
It
story.
can be an amazing feeling, by the way, where, I mean, you talk about like the great man theory. This is kind of some analog to it, right? Early in a news cycle, the way a story is covered is very important. And like, one news outlet or journalist covering a story a different way can like shape attitudes about it for weeks to come. This is partly why PR people are always like, don't say so much, but be fast, right? You want to preempt things because like that founder effect can matter. But you tell me, George, so what did, like, if you're reading like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, or whatever else, the mainstream media, what did they get wrong about the DeepSeek story?
Yeah. So there was this first narrative that it cost them $6 million to train their model. And I think that was kind of illustrative of like, and that was like, I went on Casey Newton and Hard Fork. That's the first question they asked me. And I'm like, and I'd already done a few things, but it's like, no, that is not, it did not cost $6 million to make this model. Like, you need to hire the people, you need to run the compute, you need to have the compute, you need to run a lot of experiments. Like, by the way, actually all in is probably more like $500 million. But there were enough people for whom that narrative was interesting or financially useful, for it to be a thing that like spun faster than, like, I don't know, like the loyal crowd of ChinaTalk listeners who were hearing us kind of beat the other side of the drum. And I think another thing which sort of has really been shaped by that is the export control debate, where there was this expectation that because DeepSeek exists, that means export controls are worthless. And there's lots of more nuance into that, which we've covered in lots of other podcasts we don't necessarily need to get into here. But that, like, the simplified version of that, of drawing that line from A to B, I think has really shaped the trajectory of American policy towards AI export controls, AI diffusion more broadly. And I feel like myself and the cohort of other folks who understood this sort of money thing weren't like, there was like, we have now quote unquote lost when it comes to semiconductor export controls, partially because there was this moment that really ended up reshaping narratives that the people who agree with my version of the facts were not able to sort of like seep into the halls of decision making.
No, and look, and these narratives that prevail are often, like you said, like in someone's economic or political interest, right? Like, there was a narrative after the 2024 election that Democrats lost because of low turnout, especially among younger voters. There is like a slight grain of truth in that, right? However, this was exacerbated because people don't realize that, like, it takes a month to count the vote fully in the United States, right? And the counts you see on election night, the next day, the day after, are going to shortchange turnout by tens of millions of votes, right? And so, like, but that was a convenient narrative because, people wanted to move to the left, and like, and again, it's like not entirely, it's more that younger voters shifted against, particularly young men, against Democrats, and there's somewhat lower turnout, but it's still kind of high historically. Yeah, it is tricky when you have like the more nuanced take versus like the easily memeable take. And, if you're making sports bets or something, then a lot of it's in the nuance, right? We all know this quarterback is good, but maybe he can both be very good and a little bit overrated by the conventional wisdom for X, Y, and Z reasons, and there's enough of a profit margin where you have a positive expected value on your bet,
Yeah.
right? In the news cycle, that's less forgiving, but I do think Substack and podcasts give a little bit more room for subtlety and for exploring things.
So I've like shied away from writing a book all these years. You are very quick twitch, but have also done it, and have just made the case that it's really valuable. Why don't you expand on that for me? What do you think having these 2 book projects under your belt has given you?
So for one thing, I like the process of writing a book. So ordinarily, day to day, right? I guess I consider myself like a journalist, but for the most part, the process involves me and a computer, right? And particularly when it comes to politics, like I don't really want to call a Democratic or Republican source and get their take. People are paying me for my take, right? And I don't care to be spun, and that increases the turnaround time, right? For the book, it's the opposite. My book, On the Edge involved interviews with like 200 people, roughly. A lot of people who are experts or practitioners in lots of fields that I find fascinating, right? So even if you weren't working on a book, if you like took 2 years to interview 200 really smart people about things you're really knowledgeable about, just for your own edification, like that would make you a lot smarter. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, but on this, I'm kind of, this is when I was reading the book, this is what I was annoyed by. I was like, I want to listen to the hour-long conversation you had with Peter Thiel. I think that'd be fascinating. If it's on the record anyways, like, why not sequence it that way?
I think I thought people that I spoke with were often very candid, maybe against kind of narrow self-interest in writing the book. In some cases, but I would never approach somebody and say, "Oh, I want to talk to you about X," right? I would approach them and say, "I'm writing a book about X. It'll be published in a year or two." And I would just always be very honest about like the rationale or the pretense for the conversation, right? And I feel like it would be like I think if there were something, if something Peter Thiel had said that was like super newsworthy, and I'm trying to remember those conversation where they were more explicit. Let's say it was just like a conversation without ground rules where it's like, yeah, I'll talk to you. I understand it's for a book. And someone says something that's newsworthy in a non-book context. I don't think it's like over some bright line journalistically, but it's like a little bit ethically fraught, right? Like one thing people say, like with Sam Bankman-Fried, that was an explicit understanding. He definitely told me things because he thought the timeline would be enough to insulate him from some risk, right? Or he could shape the narrative somehow. It wound up coming out after he was already sentenced in prison, right? But people, you'll have a reporter who embargoes some reporting, like on a political project. Like there should be lots of books about like Biden's decline, and the fact is that like people will tell you more when they have more protections, right? And so probably 80% of my interviews were more or less fully on the record, right? Sometimes the background interviews are the off the record, and journalists have a lot of distinctions for these terms, and they're in between categories where it's like, you can publish this with approval, and I don't love that, but like, I did it for 1 or 2 important sources where I thought it was like the least bad option. People are more candid if they understand the context of your project and believe it's coming out in the context of a book that puts everything into like a broader universe. Like I am reluctant to like, look, I used to work at the New York Times and, ended in 2013, but now I write for them a few times a year still. So it's friendly, right? If the New York Times calls me for a story, I'm still sometimes reluctant to say anything because you're gonna be have 1 or 2 quotes that's put into their narrative that may or may not suit your selfish purposes and may or may not be accurate too. I mean, the Times is a very popular paper in part because they do write in narratives, right? Even a boring quote unquote story, unless it's like economic data is now also an interesting case, right? Where
Yeah.
like, but like everything has like a little bit of spin on the ball, good writing, a good headline. Never anything wrong with those things, right? But sometimes there's more of a narrative that is a little bit reductionist, and they are the best in the business, right, or among the best. So when you deal with people who don't have those journalistic standards, then you'll encounter more problems potentially.
We have these nice historical interludes in the book. Is that a type of, it's like sort of like non-journalism driven writing? Is that something that's potentially on your horizon as well, or how do you think about hanging out in the archives for a year or two?
I mean, history and statistics are blatantly tied together. You know what I mean? For this NFL project, I'm like researching every NFL game played back to the 1920s, right? It's kind of remarkable to see how this one sport has survived with significant changes, but but you'll come across something, you're like, why were there no games played that day? Oh, it's the September 11th attacks, right? Or something like that, right? And you encounter kind of changes in like real world behavior and technological changes. And any statistical model is, sometimes they can involve kind of extrapolation from first principles, but the most empirical ones are just saying, okay, we are extrapolating from history and making an assumption, because it is a big assumption, right? That the trends that existed in the past will correctly extrapolate out to the future. And often they don't. Economic forecasting is notoriously difficult because there are regime changes, right? The economics of the internet era versus the pre-internet era versus the pre-automation era versus the pre-agricultural era. Not that there's great research on those, are all very different. I think kind of the field of economic history, sometimes called progress studies, right, is quite underrated, right? The notion of like why different societies, great powers or not so great powers, like rise and fall, right? Why is South Korea as prosperous or more than Japan today per capita when there was a 10x or 20x gap 40 years ago? These things seem like really high stakes, really important questions. And because they play out at longer time scales, often don't motivate people as much, but they seem vital and they seem very important. Even within AI, from what I understand, right, there's not really, even the AI companies are not really putting a lot of effort into kind of thinking about kind of what's this look like in 5 or 10 years. And they have longer time horizons than most, right? But not really forecasting how does the entire world change if we do achieve super intelligence. They talk about it a lot, listen to the Doorcash podcast, whatever, it's a popular subject, but that's probably substantively more important than what's in the daily news cycle.
There's like a myth of a software engineer who's like annoyed by something in the Spotify app and then joins Spotify for 2 weeks, fixes it, and quits. I'm curious if there are any, what would the maybe 2-week stint if you could plop yourself down anywhere in government, and maybe the 1 or 2 year version of what you think would be aligned with your skills and interests.
Let me redesign the Constitution, I guess, right? Maybe we need a ban on partisan gerrymandering, and we need to change the Senate and things like that. It's look, to some extent I've done that. I was dissatisfied with the way elections were covered, right? So it kind of started out as what I thought was like a little 2-week project, became kind of a life altering career. I'm trying to think of the kind of context of, I do feel like there's maybe like a little more open, I know it's like New York City is like a new subway map now, which is much more legible. I saw that the other day. That was a nice little improvement. I do feel like it could be like a good restaurant consultant. Like, this restaurant's not going to work, right? I live in this neighborhood. Nobody ever walks in this block. Why they walk on 8th Avenue and not 7th Avenue, I can't explain, right? Or getting into St. Mark's, I guess, right? But things like that I could help with, or the way you're presenting this thing is really, to some extent being like I notice like copy editing problems in advertisements and things like that a lot, right? So the notion
we're not thinking big enough. Come on. Okay. What cabinet secretary, what are we, some bureau? Zohran's like, I'll give you any job, Nate. What is it?
How to have a good poker scene in New York and be like, okay, we've got to have like poker rooms. We don't need the rest of the gaming. Yeah, I guess I sort of agree with the abundance critique where like I think New York just takes like an awful lot of time to build things. I mean, I think at local government, I think there often is incremental improvements that are made in different ways, right? And in New York, like our new infrastructure projects, LaGuardia Airport, the other airports, right? The West Side redevelopment, they're all nice. It just took too long and were too slow, right? But like, yeah, like Zoran's like a, maybe I'm wrong, right? He's to my left. I do think that he's like enough of an outsider and a bright enough guy that like, he might do those smart experimental things that don't just kind of fall under kind of like bureaucracy and inertia. I don't know, where was it, Japan or Korea, where they have like little lights embedded in the side. Like, oh, that's just pretty cool, right? Just like little things for like cross, if you're looking down and you know when to cross or when not to. I mean, I think
all right, you're a Department of Special Projects. Like, let's just make life better on the margin a little bit, guy. Or we're gonna let Nate Silver rewrite the Constitution. More barbell theory.
Sure, think big.
Nate
Barbell
Silver
theory. Think bigger.
Change.
Think bigger. Think small. Absolutely.
Okay. Let's do barbell theory again with money. So say SBF like it hits. And you're just his advisor, and like you got billions of dollars to like spend on dumb shit, or maybe not dumb shit. I don't know. Where are you putting your marginal, $10 billion of philanthropy around politics? Let's do it around politics, not just like.
Well, see, because I don't think politics is a very effective use of. I mean, if it is, it's at the local level, right? If you look at like projects that were really successful, right? Like, I think one of the most successful projects in American history is the conservative movement's multi-decade effort to win control of the American court system, right? I mean, these Supreme Court justices serve 5 times longer than presidents on average or whatever, right? So like they're like doing ground level long-term work, I think is quite valuable. Look, I think the notion of like how to make government more
let's stay on that actually for a second, because like one of the things that story did is just invest in ideas and people and kind of like the intellectual superstructure for this movement, and that like. There don't seem to be, I mean, maybe we're starting a little bit now with the sort of abundant stuff and Patrick Collison funding progress things, but like there seem to be a lot less sort of center or left billionaires who are like investing in like the interesting like intellectual ecosystem to kind of like grow the movement. So college kids or like law students are into your thing instead of, whatever the default thing is.
You probably see more of it on the right. I mean, I think like the Peter Thiel Fellowship Program, where he's paying kids to drop out of college, like that's an interesting ideological project that has produced some degree of success, right? I mean, like the effective altruist would say that like you want to purchase like anti-malaria mosquito nets in the third world, and like probably that's very effective. But for I don't know. I mean, look, I as much as I think like, oh, there's lots of inefficiency in politics and government, right? It also reflects the kind of revealed equilibrium from complicated systems and complicated incentives, and maybe kind of change is like harder to achieve, right? I mean, it's part of the reason why I'm reluctant to give like off the cuff answers, right? Like I believe there have to be improvements that you can make in government efficiency. Why does it cost 10x more to build a mile subway track in New York than in France or Spain or Japan or whatever, right? I also think there are probably a lot of really sticky factors kind of explaining why that's the case, right? I mean, part of the, in principle, I'd be on board with a project like Doge, for example. But Doge should have been, the first thing he should have done for 3 months is to study this. You know what I mean? Not like a fake commission, but like to actually study, okay, where's the overlap between problems that are where there really is inefficiency and where it's tractable and solvable, right? Like that's not something you could answer off the cuff or just kind of looking at a spreadsheet, right?
Would you ever join a campaign, Nate? Has that offer
No, it
come
would
across
be
your
about no.
table?
I don't think I've ever really been offered that, believe it or not, and like it just kind of goes against my ethos, right? I want to study. I want to have the outside view on politics, and I think all this is pretty rough. Like in campaigns, it's very tough because like you basically have one outcome, right? Do you win or lose? I guess in the presidential primaries, you have 50 states and they go in sequence, so it's a little bit better, right? But like it's very hard to know what worked or what didn't, right? Kamala Harris and Donald Trump had like lots of different subtle, nuanced strategies. And, you know, the fact is that if inflation peaked at 4% instead of 9% in 2022 or whatever, then she might have won. You know what I mean? Having nothing to do with like strategy per se. And so it's very hard to get kind of feedback on campaigns. I'm skeptical that like you can gain as much through better messaging as you might think. And again, kind of it becomes saturated, right? The first time, you know, the next candidate uses Zoran style messaging will probably get something out of it, right? The fifth one who does, it might backfire because it seems like a bad facsimile of what he was before, right? Just like there are kind of like various like Obama imitators or mini Trumps or whatever else. And people like novelty and they like some sense of authenticity. You know, what seems authentic is very tricky. I mean, Trump in many ways is a very fake kind of plasticky person, right? And yet he kind of has this ironic, like camp almost level of authenticity that I think would have been hard to predict in advance. I mean, I was like not alone in 2015 when he's going down the elevator at Trump Tower to think this is a joke, right? And you know, again, this gets to the limits of prediction in general. The world's complicated and dynamic and contingent and circumstantial, and social behavior is contagious, and the focal points created by the media and the internet do more of this where things can change unpredictably and rapidly. And so I think you know, I think there's less political science in running campaigns than in a lot of other fields that might plausibly be in my interest set.
Yeah, it's interesting because like, you know, the big tactical decision that people are still talking about is like, why didn't she go on Rogan? Well, like, even if she did, it wouldn't have gone well because like she does not vibe with that. And it's like a bit of a sort of revealed preference of her not doing this sort of open-ended media because she doesn't fit it. So, you know, there is an aspect of like, you can only Manchurian candidate your candidate to like go so far from like, you know, their essence as a human being. And I do think like, you know, until we're electing AI models, people can still just get a sense for whether they like or dislike people. And that like is probably 2 or 3% in a national election, just on its face.
When former president, soon to be future President Trump got shot, what was it, June or July of last year? Like, very sympathetic moment. I've never voted for Trump and I wouldn't, but like even then I felt some sympathy, right? You know, that moved the polls by like 1 or 2 points, right? One of the most momentous events of the past 50 years of American campaigns, right? When Biden had the worst debate presidential history, that moved the numbers by maybe 2%, right? They were 2% that mattered because he was already behind and now he fell further behind, right? Yeah, there are times when like preferences are extremely plastic and times when they're extremely sticky, and knowing which is which and which interventions are timed to which intervals, I think is probably important.
I've started interviewing a lot of these Polymarket investors or these Polymarket traders. It's remarkable to me that there are no like funds or teams. I assume that's just because these markets aren't liquid enough, but like what would your dream team of like skill sets if you were going to start the Polymarket hedge fund look like?
Yeah, you probably want some AI experts. You want macro. You want a mix of kind of people who are like smart little micro traders, like poker player, estimator types, right? And it's more barbell, right? And the macro people. You want a China expert, you want an AI expert, you want an expert on American politics. I think on average, the takes that Wall Street has about American politics are kind of primitive, right? You want to have someone who understands macroeconomics and inflation and the debt. So yeah, you want a kind of mix of skill sets. I mean, in terms of like what are the banks and the hedge funds and so forth doing, I mean, I think there's probably, I think different firms probably differ in what they think there is reputational or enterprise risk to trading, right? Crypto can be a gray area. Prediction markets can be some of a gray area. I suspect there's probably more of it though than you might assume. You know what I mean? Look, until the last couple of years, there definitely wasn't enough money in prediction markets overall to be worth it for institutional traders. Now there might be, especially for smaller, like if you were like a firm that want to say, we are primarily trading non-traditional assets, prediction markets, cryptocurrencies, right? Maybe low market cap stuff. Like, I mean, there are crypto hedge funds, right? I have a friend who works for a crypto hedge fund. And if they're getting more into like prediction market stuff too, it wouldn't surprise me in the least. And as prediction markets, if and when they get bigger, then the bigger quant hedge funds and eventually the Morgan Stanleys and Goldman Sachs will want to trade them too.
So you interviewed a lot of really rich people for this book. Why do they all want to start podcasts, Nate?
They do love hearing themselves talk, right? And remember, it's not just that they're rich. These are people mostly in competitive fields, a lot of them venture capital, right? Where they've had success and it goes to their head. And the critique that like, I mean, you see it in poker, right? In general, by the way, to be in a winning streak in poker is helpful. It improves your attitude. It makes people fear you, right? You'd rather, but like you can go on winner's tilt, it's called, right? Where you're, and it's very hard. Like when you're powerful, people start catering to you. I mean, the Emperor's New Clothes is like kind of one of the more accurate fables, you know, that and like The Boy Who Cried Wolf, I think are like the two eternal fables that like describe human behavior, extremely well. Right. And if you're somebody who like, I mean, Elon Musk, right? He has made several really good bets, whether they're skilled bets or luck. I mean, if the fourth SpaceX rocket had blown up, I mean, even he, I think, told Walter Isaacson, yeah, I was going to be cooked, right? But it's very hard if you're one of these people who was like, and again, it's just like, one thing I've learned, Jordan, is like, there's just always one more tier of wealth and power behind a closed door than you might expect, right? There's kind of one more privilege level. Even in an event that's already privileged, there's a VIP room and a VIP room within the VIP room, and then the biggest VIPs of all are not even at that; they're already at the after party, right? And there are smaller worlds too. Like the number of people, who was it, Keith Rabois, or Rabois, I don't know how you say it, told me like there are really only 6 people in all of Silicon Valley that matter, right? Which is an exaggeration, but maybe not like directionally that wrong. Maybe a few dozen, right? And they all know one another. And, you know, I think with the tech types, the VC types, I mean, you know, they feel like they're embattled by their employees are too woke and the media is mean to them. And like, you know, I mean, people are mean to me on the internet sometimes, right?
Yeah,
But like,
I don't know. I don't like. Sorry. So square the like. There's always one level up thing. You know, there's always one. You know, deeper circle of hell to the
or privilege, right? There's some, you know.
Okay. But like, what is like? Okay, but if that's your theory of the world, then like, why do you want to have like a audience of 10,000 people listening to you talk about the news?
Well, look, I mean, part of what I've done is like go from a giant platform. I used to work for ABC News, right? Which is about as mainstream as it gets. The average watcher is 70 years old at an airport somewhere or something, right? Or maybe a retirement home. And now with Substack, it's an audience that it turned out not to actually be narrower because the notion of building an email list is a good business model and very sticky. But at first, the stuff that goes behind a paywall is definitely reaching fewer people, but they're willing to pay and you're self-selecting too. I mean, I because the work I do, especially when it comes to election forecasting, is so easily misinterpreted, I don't mind having a filter for people who come to the problem with more knowledge, right? And it also can make the writing sharper. I mean, if I am freelancing with the New York Times, I have a good editor over there, right? They're often slow down, you have to explain this thing better. It's nice to have a conversation where hey, you're starting with this and that premises and you're starting with a memory and I've stated this complicated thing before about my political views on an issue that might come into play, or I've disclosed and I, consult for Polymarket. I mean, it's a cumulative project, and inherently nobody has time for everybody's cumulative project. And so to have a smaller audience of even dozens of people, hundreds or tens of, or thousands, much less tens of thousands, that's pretty important. And especially if there is maybe an unfortunate degree of concentration of influence and wealth and power, then in working on the book, one of the things that surprised me is how many people that I had no connection with were willing to have a conversation with me, or at least provide a polite response if they had a good reason not to, right? It's a pretty small world and people talk to one another, and that's something that's shifted a little bit. Again, maybe toward more this great men. Not all of them are great men. Not all of them are men, although a lot of them are, toward this theory where individual agency matters more.
I mean, my 2 cents on this is I think there's a big cognitive bias of Keith Rabois to want to think that he is the center of the universe.
Of course.
There are more times than you would think where you have sort of the market providing the discipline, or the people, or the bigger sentiment once something blows up, where politicians or the media end up kind of reflecting mass opinion more than they do the opinion of 3 people who are trying to pull the strings.
One tip I heard in poker recently is that everybody is the main character of their own poker story, right? So if I got caught making a big bluff against a third party earlier in the hand, and you're sitting at the table not involved in the hand, Jordan, you're going to be on your phone. You might not even notice that, right? If you got bluffed by another player earlier and I'm not involved, that affects much more my strategy against you than what I did before, because I'm not involved in your narrative, right? Except to the extent I affect you. And I feel like life is often the same way.
But by the way, ChinaTalk, it's the only narrative that matters. Keep tuning in for more visions into the future. This was really fun. Thanks, Nate.
Absolutely, Jordan.
I guess my last inside baseball question is Silver Bulletin. It's a great name. ChinaTalk. I don't know. I gotta get out of it somehow. But I don't want it to be the Jordan show. So
people didn't like the people didn't like Silver Bulletin name at first, because I came up with in 3 minutes, because I thought Twitter was going to die and needed some placeholder. A lot of names are stupid when you think, I think about sports names are kind of, the Green Bay Packers. It's kind of a dumb name. You know what I mean? And but it just sticks, and it kind of seems normal because people repeat it over and over again.
Yeah, it's not I have names I'd be fine with. It's more just the switching cost is not transparent to me, how much it'll change listenership or open rates, or whether, it puts me on a larger growth trajectory because I wouldn't change my coverage to do less China. Right now it's still 50% China, but it would just send a new signal that it's more than China here.
That's an interesting, Kate, because if it's just a name, it's a little awkward, or because it does include implicit premise for what the subject is, that might actually, most of them would say, yeah, the switching costs are actually pretty high, and to sacrifice brand recognition is costly, right? Yeah, maybe you need to start a sub brand or something. I don't know. That's a trickier one than for most people, I think.
Yeah, because the other thing is advertisers are terrified of China. Like that's
Okay,
just a
well
dirty
that
word.
tips over to like being yeah.
Yeah. So then I think it's more like once I have a big contract, once I have Google telling me, Jordan will buy $500,000 of ads only if it's called, the Jordan Schneider Show. Like then you'll know we're doing
For
okay.
500K, I think that'd be worth it.
Yeah. All right. Nate, we end every episode with a song. Do you got like a river song, village song? Got a favorite poker song? I don't know. Betting song?
I like shoegaze rock, like My Bloody Valentine. I'm dating myself a little bit.
Okay.
I don't often listen to like music when I'm playing poker, but I was trying to like, when I'm tired, sometimes I'll do it to avoid the annoying conversations. Listen to like ambient, like Aphex Twin and stuff a lot. I don't know. I had a music phase. I played guitar for about 6 months.